Since a very young age, my parents would tell me all sorts of stories about the fae, elves, and little people. For many years, I believed in magic and fairies, but when I turned 12, I stopped believing. At that time, me and my family were at our summer cottage. It was midsummer, and where I'm from, we have a lot of traditions for the celebration. One of our traditions was that if you pick 7 different flowers from the forest and place them under your pillow, then that night you'll dream of your soulmate. It was around 11 o'clock and I went out with my cousin to get some flowers. On other years we had gone to pick the flowers behind the cottage, but this year we felt more adventurous and we decided to get the flowers from the forest nearby. The sun had just set and it was getting dark very quickly. When we had walked in the forest for about 5 minutes, we already had 4 flowers. We only needed 3 more. But it was getting really dark and I got an unsettling feeling. Then suddenly a big branch fell from a pine tree, only a few meters from us. That's when we noticed that we weren't on our property anymore. We were in our creepy neighbor's forest. Well, he wasn't that creepy, just a little odd. We would often hear him singing to himself. This night again, we heard him singing. By the way, he's like 70. So we heard him singing and we got a little creeped out. At this point, it was dark, so we decided to go home without finding all the flowers. Back at home, my cousin asked me what the singing in the forest was, and I just replied that it was our neighbor. The next day, we had a little party like we do every year. At the party, there were some of my close relatives, and like every year, our neighbor, who is, by the way, our only neighbor. After the party, when he was about to leave, I asked him if he was singing the other day, and he said that he wasn't. I then asked him if he ever sings to himself, and he said no. This made no sense because no one lives in that area except us and him, our one neighbor. But thinking back, I did notice that every time I heard the singing, it sounded a little off, like non-human. And if it wasn't our neighbor singing, and no one in our family, then who or what was? This happened to me when I was between the ages of 2 and 4. I always thought it was a dream, but listening to your stories, I think it might have been real. I live in southeast Alabama, and at this house we had a huge fig tree. I was not a healthy kid. I died twice when I was a baby, had multiple surgeries on my feet, and have a rare blood disease that only a handful of people in the 80s had. I don't remember full details of what happened, but only some. I remember being in this place with a whole lot of kids. Some older than me, some my age. They were all lined up to be eaten by this caterpillar centipede thing. It was female, very large, and I think she was green, don't really remember. But what I do remember was very horrific, even for a person my age back then. I saw this thing eating children. It was so horrible, I cried. But someone was watching me and saved me. I don't know who he was, but I would love to thank him personally one day if I ever get the chance. I don't even remember what he looked like, except that he was tall. He wore black and white clothing. That's all that I really remember about the guy. In one of your Scary Fairy Bestiary stories, I learned about the odd Goggy. I don't know if it was that fairy or something else, but I still remember that incident until this day. I'll be turning 33 in August, and this is just so haunting to me. I'll never forget it. I hope I can get some answers one day about both the fairy and the guy who saved me. When I was like 2 or 3, I wandered into the kitchen late one night and saw a large creature holding a staff in one hand. It was like a humanoid vulture. Basically, it wore a cloak and its wings lapped around its body, and it had a huge beak, though its head looked more human and it had human eyes. It did not give off an evil or upsetting aura, and at the time I thought it was God, because it seemed to observe me before moving on, and it actually had a calm atmosphere to it. I honestly can't make out if it was a dream or not, but it always felt very real, and has stuck with me to this very day. I believe I have seen a fairy. At the time of the sighting, I was 10 years old. The house we lived in had a huge garden with a fence separating a second part of the property that was completely untamed and had huge trees and long grass. Technically, I wasn't allowed to go back there because of snakes, but my little brother and I snuck out there one afternoon during the holidays. We were just wandering around chatting to each other when something high up in the sky caught my eye. It looked like a completely blue woman with a blue dress, skin, wings, and hair. I gasped and pointed to my brother, and he saw it too. The creature flew fast, and in its line of flight, there was a blue glimmer left in the air. I'd probably say it was around 15 to 20 centimeters tall, and I distinctly remember the outline of its face. I've always believed in fairies, ever since. When I was a kid, I was very imaginative. I remember once I went upstairs and believed I saw a fairy go into my parents' bedroom. When I followed it, I swore I saw it leaving behind a trail of sparkly dust. Sounds so outrageous, but that's one of my earliest memories. There was another time where it was dark in my bedroom and I turned over to the dark side of my bed, where it wasn't possible that the moonlight could peek through my curtain. I saw a green orb there that just floated into the corner behind my door. I watched it for a while before calling my parents. Of course, when they came to see, it was gone. When I was around 10 years old, I was having a sleepover at a friend's place. Her bed was on the corner of the room, running parallel to the wall. I was on a spare mattress on the floor, right next to her bed. My friend had asthma, and I woke up during the night because she was coughing. Above the head of her bed, about 20 centimeters under the roof, I saw what looked like a glow-in-the-dark sticker stuck there on the wall. It was 2D, flat, and looked like the side view of a typical fairy you might see in a kid's book. But it couldn't have been a sticker. It was moving. It had its hand on its hips and was kicking its legs, staring straight ahead. I freaked out, quietly, and woke up my friend. And she saw it too. And we both had no idea what it was. We hid under the blanket on my bed, and eventually I decided to be brave, and I reached out to give the curtains a shake, as her room was at the front of the property, and I thought maybe it was a light coming in from a street lamp. Nope, no effect. The little thing was still there on the wall, kicking away. After a while, I don't know how long, we had been hiding under the blankets for what seemed like an eternity. I looked again, and it was gone. I bravely decided to stand on my friend's bed and feel the wall to see if it was just a glow-in-the-dark sticker. But there was nothing there. No light in the room either. I'm almost 30 now and still don't have an explanation for what happened. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. And I've never had anything like it happen again since. When I was around 10, I was up reading in bed when I was meant to be asleep. My creaky old bed was up against the window, and I used to use a streetlight or the moonlight to read by. It wasn't that late. My parents were still awake and watching TV. The hallway lights were on too, and we lived in a fairly old sloping house where the gap between the bottom of the door and the floor was about 2.5 inches. As I read, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, against the light of the hall, in the gap under the door. I looked over and saw the silhouette of a cliché fairy, which surprised me because I grew up in Waldorf education where fairies were always depicted as being far less definitive physically. It was a teeny tiny girl whose wings flickered. When I saw her, she ducked behind the corner of the door and then poked her head and wings out to look at me again. I got out of bed and asked her to please let me see her properly and not be scared. I got about halfway across the room, she was still there, when, I kid you not, my bed creaked so loudly it's as if someone big jumped on it. I got a fright and whipped my head around to see nothing was there. And I instantly knew she'd tricked me. When I turned back, I saw her jump away. I ran to the door and threw it open to see a huge moth fly perfectly straight down the hall. I followed it and watched it fly to the bathroom window and crawl out super fast. In my whole life, I've never seen such a smart moth. I told my mom straight away, already worried no one would believe me. 15 years later, and I have never seen anything like it again. But I believe my 10-year-old self. I was a smart kid, and I was convinced. My parents are really into farming, and coming from a very urban environment, we made a lot of road trips out to farms to learn, work, get better food. On a trip back up from one of the southernmost states, we passed through West Virginia and stopped for the night at a friend's farm. I think we had met these people once or twice before, and their land was very scenic. Beautiful house on a hill with fields on one side and surrounded by forest on the other, and lots of hammocks and fire pits. It was a very nice, very relaxing place, and the couple who owned it had kids about my age at the time, 8 to 12 years old, that I shyly played with for quite a while until they left to do their own thing for a bit. I was happily alternating between reading a book and trying all the hammocks, but As it got darker and I got drowsy more quickly than normal, I finally decided to stick to a nice hammock that was fairly close to the forest and read. At some point, I stopped being able to pay attention to the book, so I put that down and just enjoyed the breeze, the sway of the hammock, and the silence. Looking back, that silence was eerie. The forest had plenty of life and frogs and such, and the other kids were still playing, and the adults were talking nearby. It should not have been so noiseless. Then it started, softly but gaining volume. The noise that trees make when a strong breeze blows through them despite the windless night. Then the sound of rain was introduced. Not hard rain, but the soft noise it makes when it's just about to sprinkle. Again, it was rainless that night, and the sound started from nothing and gained loudness and depth I have never heard since. After the quote-unquote wind and rain, soft calls of birds that I know for sure are not native to America. Then an orchestra of frogs and strange drums. And finally strange music on an instrument I do not know. The noise grew and became almost painful, but it was also inviting. I wanted to sing with this strange cacophony. I wanted to sing so badly. At the time, I was very self-conscious, especially about my voice. I barely even spoke most of the time. But yet I was so tempted to sing. I didn't sing though. I felt entranced, but I didn't sing. The music kept getting louder and more dissonant, as if it was angry at my refusal. I don't know what triggered me to, but finally I left, feeling entranced but very confused. As soon as I turned my back to the forest, it all just stopped. It went silent for a moment, then all normal noises of the night returned. My parents had just noticed that I wasn't around and were about to go look for me. They weren't worried. I was a loner kid who liked climbing trees and reading there. But they said they hadn't seen me for about an hour, and it was getting late. And it was late, very dark. It had been about 20 minutes till sunset when I put down my book. I didn't tell my parents, I just said I got caught up in a book, but I thought it was really strange that they couldn't see me. I was in a hammock within throwing distance of their fire pit. Later, I went on a night walk and talked to one of the girls about the weirdly euphoric, inviting music. And she went white and told me that if I had sung, I would have been taken by the forest. I don't know if she was joking or not, but from her reaction, I have reason to believe she was serious. That finally let the weirdness sink in, and I got a bit freaked out. For the rest of our stay, I felt watched any time I was near the forest, or any time I could even see it. My family left the next day at mid-morning, taking a road along the forest, and I remember still feeling watched for 20 minutes of the drive while we left that place. Haven't been back since. I have no reasonable explanation for this event. I recently heard of an interesting story from my friend when she was a little girl. She lived in a big house in Michigan with just her and her dad. The house was surrounded by a forest, and the houses in the area were few and far between. After she had played outside the whole day, she came in and ate dinner and went to bed as usual. But that night, she had a strange dream that she was in the forest next to her house. She was just lying down on the grass when she saw something move out of the corner of her eye. She looked up and saw a creature that appeared to be a pixie. The pixie was about 5 inches tall and had green clothes and a red hat. When she looked at it, it shot an arrow at her, which hit her in the arm. The next morning, she had a scar right where the arrow had hit her. This was about 30 years ago, and she said that she doesn't remember much except for how real the whole thing seemed. And she still has that scar to this day. When I was little, I used to daydream a lot. This may sound fairly common for a kid, but it was a bit different. I would sort of just wish myself away almost, at the speed I wanted to, not just natural drifting off, although that did happen sometimes. The place I used to go to the most was, now this is odd to say, but it was deep in the woods behind my grandparents' house, and literally under the pond. Like, the pond would flip upside down when I would get to it, and I'd be in this place that was underneath. Now, as a kid, I tended to wander, and whenever my mom noticed I was gone, just before she started to panic, I would, according to her, come walking out of the woods or from down the road from one of the trails around our neighborhood. Keep in mind, this is all between the ages of 6 and 10, and this was late 80s, early 90s. Well, what I do recall with vivid detail is that I always arrived in the place under the pond, somewhere in a hedge maze and garden that stood in front of this huge stone mansion. It had big stone columns and floor-to-ceiling windows with flowing white curtains. The French doors were always open and the house was never closed in at all. I would come around the corners of the maze, past the fountains and the gardens. There was always this extra long table, which was more like 5 or 6 tables outside with a white tablecloth. It was always completely covered with cakes, cookies, and fruit. Also random unlit candelabras as centerpieces. I never ate anything, and the people there never offered. Almost like the food was there if I wanted, but it was totally up to me. There were always other kids there running and playing around, dressed all in white. There was always a pair, though, a boy for each girl, very even. This was also true for the adults. Everyone had a pair, including me. There was a little boy who looked very similar to me, and we knew we were partners somehow. The adults were all tall, beautiful, model types. One would come get me once I arrived and redress me in all white clothing like the other kids. They would primp and fix me and straighten my hair bows and buckle my shoes. They kept me pretty close, but until the kids would come around, and then they would send me off running with them. Everyone was totally manicured and polished. Now, I know what you were thinking. Why would a child not think this was very alarming, even at my age? Well, at those ages, my mother had me in child modeling. I would very often go to large homes and beautiful gardens. When there, strange adults would dress me and do my hair, so I went years thinking this was just a weird under-the-pond photo shoot I always went on without my mother. That was until I got a little older. When I turned 10, I had completely stopped going there and forgot it existed. Until one day, I just randomly remembered it, like a crazy light bulb went off. I asked my mom about it, and she didn't know the place I went to. She asked me what type of pictures they have me doing, and I know that I never took any. I just told her I wanted to go back to that house with the kids in the garden. She obviously was confused by this and told me that it had never happened. That night, I lay down in bed trying to force myself to remember so that I could prove my mom wrong. That's when it happened. I was having an almost out-of-body experience where I sort of thought of the place and walked through it in my head, if that makes any sense. The place was not at all as I remembered. It was nighttime, which startled me as I had only ever been there during the day. The curtains there were ripped and destroyed. The floor-to-ceiling windows were broken, and the place was trashed. I had never arrived in the house first, always in the maze, so I went outside to look around. It was like the place was in the middle of a tropical storm. Wind was blowing things over, and the table, still covered in food, was all trashed as well, and things were tipped over. Then, out of nowhere, someone grabbed me. It was one of the adult men who I used to see there. They were all very tall, so he bent down with both hands on my shoulders and talked directly face to face with me. He said, "What are you doing here? You can't be here. It's not safe. They found us. You have to go. You have to leave now." It was strange. I don't understand how he knew I was there or where to find me. I can't remember how I got back, but I do know he did it. He sent me back somehow. I'd always felt a great sense of loss after that, like I lost my family. It always seemed like I had slipped into an alternate universe or been abducted by aliens to me. But now that years have passed, I believe it was fairies. Now, just a few weird things about me. I laugh a lot, and people tell me I have an addicting laugh. I've often found myself wandering around forests or wooded areas alone, and I'm never scared. I love animals and pastries, a big reason why I cannot believe that table didn't interest me at all. This all might seem normal, and it is, but what never made much sense to me is how much I hate iron. Like, I will not touch it, and when I do, it feels like my hands are literally on fire. I don't like metal at all, honestly, but iron is just wretched. I think maybe something of them may have rubbed off on me somehow. I've heard stories of people being coerced to stay by the fairies or being pressured to eat their food. None of this happened. I was allowed to come and go as I pleased, and the food just sat there, looking absolutely stunning in the garden. These are the reason my mind never went to fairies, but maybe I was too little and they didn't want to keep me? I don't know. One time I do remember not wanting to play with the kids who always seemed to be repeating the same games over and over again, almost like they couldn't stop. I saw one of the ladies watching over us like the adults did from time to time, standing at the upstairs balcony of the house. I veered off from the kids and went up to her. I just sat next to her and watched the ground from above with her. She straightened my clothes and brushed my hair without saying a peep. Then a man came in the room from behind us and muttered something about me being up there instead of down with the kids. She, in a very motherly or guardian way, told him flat out, "She doesn't feel like it and wants to sit up here. She's fine, she doesn't have to play if she doesn't want to." Once again, this was nothing like anything I've read in most fairy stories. Since then, for some years, I've been trying to get this out there to find help with an explanation, all to hit dead ends. I posted on Reddit, blogs, everywhere, thinking it could be paranormal, until it hit me. It was fairies. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all the subscribers who submitted their stories for this one, and to all the Reddit users as well who gave me permission to read theirs. The links to those will be in the description. Special thanks to all my supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are given to this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description along with some other support options as well. I'm always collecting your true fairy stories, so please send them along if you've had an experience you'd like to share. I would love to read it. My email is also in the description. In the meantime, please comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new, And don't forget to hit the bell if you want to receive notifications of my next video. And until next time, this has been a visit from your Scary Fairy Godmother.